Never, never fly straight and level for more than 20 seconds. If you do, you'll die. Given time, all historical events become controversial. That is the nature of things. We question and rewrite the past, glamorizing it or diminishing it according to our own inclinations or the social and political views of the present. Historians, indeed whole schools of history, have made their reputation by casting a jaundiced eye on the victories, heroes, and triumphs of their forefathers. Nobody in academe gets tenure or a reputation in the media by examining the events of the past with approval or by praising the decisions of past statesmen and military leaders as wise and sensible. If my aunt had balls, she'd be my uncle. Welcome to Billy's Books. Today we're going to do another war book about World War II with Wings Like Eagles by Michael Korda. This is about the Battle of Britain, which is the Battle of Britain was the battle over the Channel, and when the Germans tried to attack the Great Britain in 1940 and were repelled by the RAF for the most part. Though there are other things happening. This is mostly about the RAF. Before the war started, the general idea for the defense was bombers. I guess it was the idea was you bomb us, we'll bomb you back, and fighters were considered less important than bombers. But there was a guy, Dowding, he sort of became the important guy that's sort of really had more foresight than everybody else years before the war, and was like, no, fighters are going to be the thing. The fighters are going to take down the bombers, and fighters are going to defend the bombers. So there you go. He saw that, and he got a lot of pushback. This Dowding guy was not very friendly. He was very smart, but very unfriendly. He was not political in any way. He just made enemies left and right. Even though he was right, he'd piss people off by being right or being gruff or whatever, and it really didn't help. But there you go. The general idea of the bombers versus the fighters thing, there was an expression called "the bombers will always get through." They seemed to think that there was no way to stop bombers. I guess that included fighters, which of course were the things that prevented them from getting through. So that's on the British side. The Luftwaffe was run by Hermann Göring. He had a big ego. He claimed that Luftwaffe could take the UK by itself and pound them into submission, so they would just surrender. And that just goes to show you how little they understood of the British. But it turns out, actually, they underestimated the British, not just their fortitude, but also the RAF. That's Royal Air Force, by the way. The Royal Air Force was actually more prepared. One of Dowding's thing was to hide how strong they were, so the Germans would keep underestimating them. And so they never brought out all their squadrons at once. They would bring them out piecemeal and stuff like that. So the Germans would always come and attack and think there weren't that many guys, when in fact there were a lot of fighters waiting for them. And that worked because Dowding's plan was a war of attrition for Germany, whereas some of his opponents were like, no, we should just go full blast. There was a thing called the big wing theory, where you don't send out little squadrons to just attack. You sort of get them all up and form an enormous formation, and then take over and sort of overwhelm the opponents. Unfortunately, there were a lot of drawbacks to that. One was that to build a big wing, you had to get everybody up there, and everybody would have to keep on idling and getting ready, waiting for everyone else to take off, so that it took forever. So there was really very slow response time. The Germans also underestimated and didn't really understand that Dowding had anticipated radar. He was like, radar is going to, he was talking about for early warning and stuff. The Germans didn't understand it. And they thought the stations were independent, but in fact they were all connected. It was quite impressive how much they prepared, and the Germans didn't know. Dowding was Stuffy. His nickname was Stuffy Dowding, in fact. The fighters that they developed, the British developed the Hurricane, which were big and slow but adaptable, and the Spitfire, which were narrow, fast but very expensive. They developed both these fighters simultaneously, and they ended up, having different purposes in the war. Obviously, the Spitfire could attack the bombers quickly from above. One of the things we learn about, in this, is that bombers fly evenly, and they have to be protected by the fighters, but to attack fighters, you have to get above them and come down. That is basically how it worked at that time. So the higher up you go, the longer it takes to get there, but then the better it is to come down. And they didn't have, and the radar, by the way, was only on the ground. It took them a couple years before they could put radar in the fighter planes or in the airplanes in general, and that took a long time. So when the Germans were attacking at nighttime, for a while the British couldn't defend themselves because it was dark and they didn't have radar in their planes yet, and you couldn't just do radar from the ground and say, up there somewhere within a 5-mile radius is your guy, because that wasn't specific enough. So for a while they were on the defensive when the Germans started attacking at night. The Germans had developed their own thing for dealing with night because, of course, Great Britain would black out, so everything would be dark. So if they flew over, they couldn't see anything. But the Germans developed this other thing where they would have like radio beams going one way along the axis of the bomber's flight, but then they would beam another kind of trigger beam that would cross it at the point where you're supposed to drop the bomb. So the Germans would fly along their axis, then they get to the point where the beam is, and they would then drop there, and that was somewhat effective, and it took British a while to figure that out. The Luftwaffe was developed as the Lufthansa even back in the 20s, when they were already breaking the rules. They were like, oh, no, it's just, they were developing, commercial flights officially, but unofficially underground, they were already developing their fighters and bombers and things like that. The Germans had a bit of an advantage with their bombers and fighters because they participated in the Spanish Civil War, so they should have been better at it than they were when they finally met the British. Hitler didn't like boats. He didn't understand boats. He understood land war, and so he wasn't too into the Navy thing, and he sort of neglected the Navy, and he also didn't really understand air flight that well. So, and he kept on putting off an invasion of Britain through the whole summer. They were constantly almost about to attack, but didn't. At the beginning of this, that famous situation on Dunkirk, where the British had to escape France by a bunch of boats, civilian boats as well as military boats, back to England. And they were pretty much all trapped there, and the Germans could have wiped them all out at that point, but instead Hitler was preoccupied with taking Paris, so he spent most of his attention to take Paris instead of eliminating the guys in Dunkirk. That would have changed the war. Later on, the same thing happened. The Germans were getting really close to eliminating a lot of the airfields and stuff that mattered, and they would have really broken down the defenses of the Brits. They were getting really close to doing that, but then accidentally, one of the Germans bombed London, and Hitler had a very strict rule, which Göring was trying his best to enforce, which was do not bomb London. You can bomb everything else, but don't bomb London. And this guy accidentally did. So then Churchill was like, rah, 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 rah. And so then the British, oh, guess what? We can bomb Berlin. Did you know that? We bombed Berlin. And then, of course, the Nazis were like, how dare they bomb our city? So then they were like, now we're really going to bomb London. And they rediverted all their attention to basically carpet bombing London just before they defeated the RAF in their fields. If they had just gone a little bit longer, they might have defeated them. But instead they refocused their attention on London, which is a very large target. So you can carpet bomb all you want, but you're still not going to destroy London because it's so huge. Well, that's all very interesting. the people on the ground, the fighters were mostly on both Germany and England side. They were a bunch of really young men, cocky fighters as always, and they were the few. Churchill very famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." And so the few were these fighters, but there were a lot of other people doing a lot of work on the ground, including the WAAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, aka the Beauty Chorus. And they were minding the radar and conveying all the messages between the different stations and all that stuff. And they were even calling up and giving commands, telling the fighters what to do. And some of the fighters, they didn't like that. They didn't appreciate being told what to do by a woman, but most of them did. Meanwhile, there were two different camps of fighters. Remember I mentioned before about the big wing versus the small squadrons thing. There were a couple different camps of commanders who obeyed or disobeyed that rule quite a bit. Some were stuck to it strictly, and some didn't, and with different results. And of course, part of that was hiding their numbers and stuff like that, which was one of Dowding's most important things. So the one camp was like, "No, we should just go all out," but then the Germans don't know how many people you have, and the whole time the Germans were acting like they were underestimating the number of fighters, number of everything that the British had, because they were hiding their strength, and that was one of their tricks, which they eventually blew. Combat up in the air is really cold. Back in those days, they didn't, things were much more primitive, and you got way up there and you had a gas mask, but you could freeze your tuchus off up there. That was a problem. And manual controls, very rough riding. You could die instantly without even knowing it. Your enemy was invisible. All this good stuff. In the warm summer months, the pilots scrounged canvas deck chairs and sat outside in the sun or lay in the grass smoking and waiting. An aircraft man sat at a desk near the door to answer the telephone, and every time it rang, the pilots tensed. Often it was a harmless message like, "The T-van is on its way," or a routine order or inquiry from the station bureaucracy, which was proceeding on its stately way, filling out forms and holding inspections as in peacetime. And the pilots would go back to whatever they had been doing to calm their nerves and deal with the stress of waiting for the call to scramble. The sharp, loud noise of a telephone ringing was enough to make some pilots go outside and throw up, and haunted many pilots for years to come. Anticipating back in the 20s and 30s. So while the Lufthansa, future Luftwaffe, was building in the 20s and 30s, Neville Chamberlain is best known in popular culture now for being the guy that appeased Hitler. And he gets criticized for just letting Hitler go and saying da-da-da. But he was actually more strategic than people give him credit for. And that's, I guess, what the intro is about as far as historians. Neville Chamberlain was biding time so that he could develop his fighter squadron as well as the bomber squadron, because he also understood the importance of fighters. So when they finally entered the war, or the war finally came to them, they were more prepared, partly because of Neville Chamberlain. So he wasn't as dumb as he's made out to be, or as weak as he's made out to be. He had his reasons. So there. Like the previous World War II book, if you're into World War II books, it's cool. If you're not, you probably don't care. If you can't do, review.